from You with a Grain of Sand. I'm going to say a few things before we get started to sort of map out how I see this thing going. We've got a couple hours. And one of the things that was making me nervous beforehand was I've had a couple friends emailing me saying things like, "I'm really looking forward to your lecture," to which was immediately responding, "It's not a lecture. Like, it's not going to be just me talking." So I really hope some of you will have opinions or questions. We're just going to be, it's just us, a room full of mostly poets and readers, just chatting about poems. So I might be able to keep an eye on the chat, but I might not. So if you when we start the discussion, if you want to use the little raised hand button, I'll probably notice that. And View with a Grain of Sand is an interesting collection to me because it was released in the mid 90s, and I don't remember when I got this book. It just seems like it's always been a part of my life. I can't remember when I first read Szymborska, but I remember some of my first reactions when I first started seeing some of her poems, and they ranged from, "Wow, that's amazing," to, "You can do that?" I as a younger writer, the first several times I encountered one of her poems, each time was a series of minor epiphanies. But View with a Grain of Sand is an interesting collection because it's released in the mid 90s. Until Map, which is her collected, came out, it sort of was the sort of defining collection of her work translated into English. And one of the things that's interesting, or maybe even unusual about it, is the book has no introduction, which I've always sort of thought was kind of curious, a curious way to introduce a large audience to her work. And one reason the book might not have an introduction, and this is me just speculating, is because the work really needs no introduction. Her poems, she writes the kind of poems that you can just pick up this book and open to a random page and start reading, and the poem is it doesn't need a lot of additional context for you to experience that. Another reason might be it's kind of difficult to write I imagine to write an introduction for a writer like this, emerging from the history she emerges from. One of her translators for this, the translators were Clare Cavanagh and Stanislaw Baranczak, and Baranczak said, quote, "To explain to an American audience what kind of creature the contemporary Polish intellectual is seems to me an almost impossible task. Even though, or perhaps because, I can claim to be a representative of that species. A satisfactory explanation would have to include a complete course in at least the past 200 years of Polish history, a thorough sociological analysis of today's Polish society, and a presentation of the wide spectrum of contemporary intellectual attitudes toward issues ranging from politics to religion." So that would be a lot of ground you'd have to cover to create a proper introduction, and I am capable of doing none of that. I'm just a person who's read these poems and is a fan of them. But it can be useful to have some context. So for some of the things she does, and so I've compiled some notes to serve as a sort of rough makeshift introduction to her work for those in case there's anyone who hasn't encountered her before. And also, I put together a handout of some of the poems that we'll be looking at. And Hannah, did you get that to everyone, or were you sharing?
I'm planning on sharing whenever you give me the signal.
Awesome. So her full name is Maria Wislawa Anna Szymborska. She was born in 1923 in a small town in Poland. When she was 8, her family moved to Krakow, and she lived there for basically the rest of her life. For 30 years, she worked as a columnist, a book reviewer, and an editor for a weekly literary newspaper, and she also translated French literature into Polish. She was known to be a truly reclusive person. In the 9 decades of her life, she rarely did public readings, and there are surprisingly few interviews of her available. She published very slowly, sometimes 2 to 3 poems per year, and her books were all fairly slender. Even after winning the Nobel Prize, when the demand for her poems was at an all-time high, her books were sometimes considered too short for American publishing standards. One of her translators, Clare Cavanagh, says, her books were so short and so long in coming that we had to combine them to satisfy American publishers, who generally preferred books with a page count of over 30. On that subject, Szymborska was once asked why she didn't publish more poems, and she famously replied, "Because I have a trash can in my house." Speaking of her house, I'm jealous of a handful of friends who've had the opportunity to meet her. She lived in a small flat in Krakow for most of her life, and I'm told she had a taste for things that might be considered kitsch, like just generally weird things and collections of odd things, postcards of monkeys holding skulls, a music box shaped like a pig, a cigarette lighter that was shaped like a submarine, Band-Aids that looked like bacon strips. She had a toilet seat that was made of clear plastic with a strand of wire woven through it to create the illusion that one was sitting on barbed wire. Those are the kinds of things that she treasured. She made tiny collages out of newspapers and magazine clippings and would mail them as postcards to people. And she was known to host small dinner parties for friends and raffle off these things from her apartment as gifts at the end of the night. After one such evening, her translator, Clare Cavanagh, claims to have received as a gift a handful of Italian candies that was wrapped in an Italian Airlines air sickness bag. Szymborska also had a collection of air sickness bags from around the world. Friends who would come visit her would, if they flew anywhere, would save those air sickness bags and bring them to her as gifts. The collection we're looking at today, View with a Grain of Sand, contains selections from her first 7 books. And a note on the handout that you'll look at later. Those translations, those it's photocopied, and I photocopied them from I did not photocopy them from View with a Grain of Sand, because when on Wednesday when I'm like, oh, I have to turn in I have to photocopy some of these, and I looked at the poems I wanted to share with you all, and they were a little too illegible with marginalia and random notes written all over it. So I photocopied them from MAP, which should be the same translations. It's the same translators, and I tried to compare them. But if you're reading along in View with a Grain of Sand, you should be good to use either of these. So where was I? All right. So Baranczak saying to understand the context of the literature, you have to understand some of the history, and Poland has a long history with of shifting borders. It comes into existence as a country and then disappears from existence. The borders are constantly changing over the centuries. Poets in Poland have long held a place of reverence among its people that might be unmatched in many other places. For a while, Vivi and I lived in Hamtramck, Michigan, which for a long time was almost an exclusively Polish city, surrounded by Detroit. And I remember one of the librarians was talking about the literary history there, saying that Poland's older generations of poets were often buried in graveyards next to kings and military heroes. And one reason for that sort of reverence is that Polish literature kept alive a sense of cultural identity in a time when Poland's borders might be disappearing and reappearing. Joel Beal suggests that this role of this sort of celebrated role of poets she described it by saying, for almost 2 centuries, since Poland was first erased from the map in 1795, its land divided between Russia, Austria, and Prussia until the fall of communism in 1989. Poets were what kept Polish identity alive. What will eventually become Poland as we know it begins to take its shape in the early 20th century, the Second Polish Republic. The Second Polish Republic comes into being. Hold on a second. I think someone might need to move.
I think so too. Found it.
Thank you, Hannah. The Second Polish Republic comes into being and exists as its own independent nation from 1918 to 1939, and that's the Poland Szymborska is born into in 1923. And if you look at a map, you'll notice it's roughly between Germany and Russia. And in the mid 20th century, that's not often the best place to be located. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland from the west. On September 3rd, England and France, standing by a treaty to guarantee Poland's border, declare war on Germany. Germany defeats Poland's army in a couple weeks. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the east, and the Bug River essentially becomes a border dividing the country in half, with the Nazis occupying one half and Russia occupying the other half. During that time, Szymborska finishes high school illegally and in secret as secondary education had been banned. And when the war is over, her country is then occupied essentially by Stalin. There's when we talk about post-war European poetry, we're often talking about after World War II, after 1945. But with Polish poetry, we're usually talking about a generation of poets that emerge after 1956. That generation includes poets like Szymborska, Zbigniew Herbert, Rosewicz, and dozens of others. It includes figures like Miłosz, who is really like a half generation earlier. And then people like Adam Zagajewski and Stanislaw Baranczak, who are like maybe a half generation later. And 1956 is considered, it's 11 years after the war ended. And that's really when people start talking about post-war Polish poetry, that's sort of the date. And part of the reason why is the government that's been established is there's a real severe period of what's known as social realism, where the art of the time, I mean, it wasn't just censorship. It wasn't censorship that says you can't say this or you can't say that. It was also dictating what you were supposed to say. So art was supposed to support and promote and communicate the agenda of the state. And it's not really until that falls away that another generation of poets begins emerging. So that 1956, that's the year that's known in Poland as the Thaw, when the sort of most severe brand of censorship begins to fade. Stalin's been dead for 3 years. Censorship lessens. It's still a major factor, but not as severe. From 1949 to 56, social realism was basically the law for the arts. Miłosz says that censorship in Poland was relatively lenient from 45 to 49, crippling from 1950 to 56, unpredictable in the 60s and 70s. And in claiming that it was unpredictable in the 60s and 70s, we should also note that Miłosz's work was banned throughout the 60s and 70s until 1980, and he wrote in exile. Then he won the Nobel Prize, came back as a hero. His work was in circulation again, and then martial law was declared and his work was banned again. So saying censorship, what standards were better after 56, doesn't mean that that it wasn't a factor. And because of that, when we're thinking of post-war Polish poetry, we're actually sort of thinking of two groups of writers. There's a group of writers that are not writing in Poland, writers like Miłosz, who are writing sort of in exile, and they're kind of free to write whatever they want. And then there's a group of writers that are still in Poland, and they've kind of come of age under conditions of extreme censorship, and even after not necessarily being able to say what they want to say always openly or directly. And those are writers like Szymborska. And so those two branches of Polish poetry emerge in very different directions. So I think one thing that people often talk about with Szymborska is how she, her early work had to find a way around these systems. How do you create art when you're not necessarily able to produce art the way you might have produced it before, or the way you might want to, or the way your instincts might be telling you? You have to come up with sort of new modes of writing, or new modes of approaching your subjects, and that's something that a lot of people think about when they're talking about her writing, and we'll get to that later, specifically with a couple of poems. As I mentioned, this collection, when this collection appeared, it appears shortly before she wins the Nobel Prize. She's the second Polish poet in a couple decades to win the Nobel Prize. It was Miłosz and then her, and in Poland it was seen sort of as a national victory, although sort of a surprising one among literary critics. There were some voices that thought like she was a good writer, but sort of previously had seen her as a sort of junior figure to people like Herbert and Rasevich, who lots of people thought were deserving of the Nobel Prize. Though those attitudes appear more in print from literary critics and reviewers. Among Polish citizens and writers, it seemed to be viewed as a kind of national victory. And Szymborska always sort of felt like her work was emerges from a collective, from all these things that I'm describing, and the sort of writers that are emerging. She says, if you believe my poetry is any good, it's because it was created along the lines of all these other good Polish poets. Poetic talent, she says, doesn't operate in a vacuum. There is a spirit of Polish poetry. And that spirit, though its writers emerged in different ways, writing in exile or writing at home under the constant threat of censorship, produced what was a pretty radical new poetry, and its writers shared many of the same traits. One trait, and this is one thing that I noticed when I first started reading her, was that it was highly accessible. The poems made sense. Adam Zagajewski said once, I heard some French poets say that Polish poetry is just journalism because you can understand it. And Charles Simic said, Polish poetry is one of the marvels of the 20th century literature. It is very readable in a time when modernist experiments made a lot of poetry written elsewhere difficult. And Edward Hirsch in 1996 said, the greatness of Polish poetry at the end of the 20th century has much to do with its philosophical and ethical seriousness. It has come to be admired by other poets over the past 20 years or so for its immense intellectual sophistication, its lucid rejection of tyranny, and its humane and democratic values. By contrast, French poetry and German poetry can seem humorless and didactic. English poetry, narrow and provincial. American poetry as self-absorbed and naive. Polish poets have not become caught up in the postmodern fads that contemporary writers everywhere have been swept along by. And that accessibility that they're describing isn't really an accident. It was a moral and ethical choice. So when you see like her work makes sense and it's very clear, that's something that was very, very deliberate. Prior to the war, many previous generations were deeply romantic, had a strong nationalistic sense of pride and optimism toward the future. According to Edward Hirsch again, the new poets, quote, could never believe in that future again, nor could they revert to traditional forms. They rejected the aesthetics of elaborate, ornamental, and sonorous language. It was as if poetry had to be reinvented from the ground up. The major poets of post-war Poland all share a distrust of rhetoric, of false words and sentiment. The radical accessibility of contemporary Polish poetry sometimes bewildered advanced American readers who often miss the point that for these poets, stylistic clarity was a form of ethics. One might say the very clarity of this poetry is a response to ideological obfuscations and political double talk. Another trait they share, and then we'll start talking about poems. The poets who emerged during this era were understandably damaged and haunted by the war. There is a distinct type of guilt that many experienced. Today, a coarse diagnosis might call what they experienced a type of survivor's guilt, but when we talk about 1956 and why it takes so long for a generation of writers to emerge, Poland actually lost essentially a generation of writers during this war. And whatever you want to call this feeling that its new writers were grappling with, Miłosz says that the poets of this generation were aware that they, quote, wrote in the place of a generation of poets who made their debut during the war and did not survive. So that was my attempt to sort of provide what Baranczak said was necessary, 200 years of history and an overview of every aspect of life. But with that last thing I was talking about, writing in the generation, in the place of a generation who did not survive, and the awareness of that, I'd like to start by looking at a poem called Could Have. And Hannah is going to share a packet of poems.
Can you see this okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Could have. It could have happened. It had to happen. It happened earlier, later, nearer, farther off. It happened, but not to you. You were saved because you were the first. You were saved because you were the last, alone, with others, on the right, the left, because it was raining, because of the shade, because the day was sunny. You were in luck. There was a forest. You were in luck. There were no trees. You were in luck. A rake, a hook, a beam, a break, a jam, a turn, a quarter inch, an instant. You were in luck. Just then, a straw went floating by. As a result, because, although, despite, what would have happened if a hand, a foot, within an inch, a hair's breadth from an unfortunate coincidence. So you're still here, dizzy from another dodge, close shave, reprieve, one hole in the net, and you slipped through. I couldn't be more shocked or speechless. Listen how your heart pounds inside me. All right, let's talk about some poems. I thought this one felt like a good poem to begin with. As emerging from that discussion of the history Szymborska is emerging from. And one of the things that often startles me about her poems is that the first time I read this poem, I had no idea about any sort of larger history or anything about her life, but the poem kind of resonated on its own. I think anyone who sort of had a near miss or felt lucky to be alive can see something of that experience in here. And the poem makes no mention to the war or surviving the war, but once you sort of know the history that this poem is sort of emerging from, you kind of can't see it. So there's a sort of doubling that happens in a lot of her poems, where the poem, if you have if you sort of have additional context, might seem to be about one thing or about one particular manner of being lucky to survive, but it also works on its own, completely independent of any larger context. Like if I didn't know that this poet had, you know, lived through World War II, and if it was a poet, you know, writing in Vermont today, I think the poem would, you know, it would still work as a perfectly functional poem that I think a lot of people would connect with. And I guess I'll start with a question. Why is that? I mean, we now kind of know what this poem is about, but why does it work so well outside of that context?
Are you asking us?
Yes. Thank you, Charlene.
It's a dangerous world out there. There are infinite situations this could apply to, let alone everyday life and close calls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a dangerous world. There's lots of situations this could apply to. And I was thinking about that too, because there are lots of situations that this could apply to, but it's also not vague. Like sometimes when I'm working in sometimes I'll be in a creative writing class and I will hear someone say, oh, this poem could, you know, I left it open-ended because I wanted to apply to anyone or apply to anything. But then at sometimes we run into the problem like, oh, but we end up not seeing a recognizable experience there. So it could apply to a lot of things, but it doesn't feel vague. Does anyone have thoughts on that? On either of these two questions? Now I've now asked I'm just letting these questions pile up. But
I wonder if there's something to be said. We're taught to avoid cliche at all costs. And I think what's interesting about this is that Szymborska is using recognizable phrases, but the sequencing is what's so unique and curated about it, which sounds a little obvious because obviously a poem is always about sequencing, but there's an interchangeability, and even just like the listing of adverbs and prepositions, I think makes the kind of like ubiquitous nature of violence, or like the euphemistic ways that we talk about luck, feel more visceral. Just like even the phrase, you were in luck because you were the first or the last, like the arbitrary nature of that, and like the ability to torque what could be familiar language or cliche, but to sidestep that by doing it so expertly.
yeah, and you know, I think Szymborska's ear for idiom, and I guess I should make a note on translation, because some of the phrases that appear here, I'm not sure if they were Szymborska's choices or the translator's choices. And without trying to go too far off the rails, one thing I've been thinking about is a lot of times I hear people talk about how, oh, in translation, you're always going to lose a bunch of stuff. And which is true. But you know, one language doesn't have the same words as another, or the same ways of expressing something. But I also think that the poems kind of the poems land in English in a way that still feels very fresh to me. So treating them as their own sort of objects, these poems feel like fine poems that are, you know, feel very natural. And part of it could be because of what Hannah's pointing to, some of the familiarity of the language, and some of the ear for sort of idiom and a sort of casual mode of speaking. Hannah, you were saying we're taught to avoid cliche, which is interesting, because I actually wasn't totally taught that. I remember hearing that early on, but one of my early creative writing teachers said, you know, cliches are something that you should pay attention to, but he didn't say to avoid them. He said you should pay attention to because people might gloss over them, but you should also linger with them for a minute, because a cliche is a piece of language that's communicating what's often a fairly sort of complicated idea very quickly, and it communicates it with ease instantaneously to a wide number of people. So cliches can also be interesting because they can evoke a sort of expectation which you can subvert. They can call forth an idea much quicker than it might be using general discursive expository language. But yeah, I do think there's something to that. Any other thoughts on this by anyone?
Yeah,
Well,
I
it's
think.
right on- Go ahead.
Sorry. To your earlier question about why does it feel effective, and I think your impulse about it being specific, there are a lot of declarative statements that are contradictory. They're highly specific and immediately contradicted. And the sort of ethical implication of that is that there's no causation that the reader can apply to to explain the assertions that are made, which has a very unsettling and sort of ethically fraught result, because there's nothing you could have done differently. There's nothing you can take credit for. And I'll leave it there, but I was going to say that this reminds me a lot of a poem by Terence Hayes in the current New Yorker called Continuity, which uses a very similar technique of exploiting the idea of film continuity errors by repeating things like this that contradict the thing that's just gone before.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the reasons that it stands on its own without the context, as you were saying, is that that technique is very powerful.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about, I think the word you used was causality, like a reader's trying to link one thing to the next and saying, oh, this is the reason. And each one seems to be canceling out the previous while asserting a new one. You were saved because you were the first. You were saved because you were the last, which, taken together, both statements feel like they can't be true. And as you're trying to anticipate, you're trying to find a logic, and that it's constantly being disrupted as she sort of revises what she just said. And that idea of contradiction is something that we're going to come back to, I hope, a little later in with other poems, because that feels like a central part of her approach. Michael, I see you've got a hand up, a digital hand.
Well, I just wanted to add to some of the things that folks have been saying. I think you've got at least a couple of different mechanisms going on here. One is the sort of contradictions and the opposites. You were first, you were last. And there's kind of a wide distance that opens up between those two things. And then you have more like lists or accumulations, like a rake, a hook, a beam, a break, which those things are almost like word ladders, where you're changing a couple of letters each time. And so those are very small increments. And then you have the last thing about listen, how your heart pounds inside me. So I feel like from a craft level, part of what is happening is trying to find, how do I relate to you? Like, are we opposites or are we spectrums of the same thing that, you change one letter here or there and you switch from me to you, So I think a lot of those things really set up that last line really beautifully, all of those particulars that you're trying to find, like, what is the increment? What is the cause between this thing going to that thing?
What were you saying about changing one letter?
There's let's see, the third stanza, like a rake, a hook, a beam, a break. I mean, there's sonics going on in there too, but like they're 4-letter words, then 5-letter words. Like, you're only changing a couple of letters each word. The word ladder games where like you change one letter and you make a new word. Like you've got this. It's a very like recognizably small increment, at least in terms of the way that they're spelled. The meanings are quite different, but it's like there's a play of scale going on there about how much you change when you change one small thing.
I just want to make the point, Matthew, that this may be the poet's voice, but it's also every man's voice. I mean, these are phrases that you hear from everyone all the time. And I think that that's really the primary way that this poem works. The opposites and all the other things notwithstanding, these are things that we hear on the street all the time. There's nothing unusual about them. This is a way in which she is simply channeling what she hears, and people can easily identify with it for that reason, and that makes it very accessible.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it's the language itself is, you know, feels like something I might, you know, the language itself is accessible, but the way it's arranged is what makes it surprising, with the way it's constantly contradicting itself and revising itself and suggesting two things, one right after another, where both would seem like they couldn't both be true. Like, so the arrangement makes it surprising if the language is not. Valerie.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed all these comments. Thank you, and this poem. So thank you. I was noticing so much how there's what this poem says and how it says it, which is what we've been talking about, but it's also what it does. It's literally got this meter that thrums. You know what I mean? Even the title, and so it alerts you and puts you in it, but then it embodies, that's the right word, the heartbeat, so that by the time you arrive finally at that last line, you're almost out of breath, and the words are beating inside you, the heart is beating, and so it's a communion in a way with the person who's not there that she's addressing, or the person who might have been there.
Yeah. Let's get one more voice on this, because we've got one more hand raised. Susan's going to come in, and then we should move to another poem, or I will stay on this for the rest of. I could stay on one of these poems for a long time, but I do hope to cover a bunch of these. So, Susan.
Oh, I loved what was just said, and I think I lost my train of thought of what I was planning on, but yeah.
Okay, that is fine. Cami.
Sorry, I just thought I'd throw in to think about for later too, point of view, you know, writing it in the you is really important. And I think Szymborska uses many points of view. The I isn't always the poet, and the you and the we. She's kind of brave about using different points of view, inventive. And here it kind of makes you hear it as yourself, in addition to maybe being the you that is the speaker talking to herself as well.
Yeah, for me, the you, there's moments where it seems to be, it has the feel of a direct address, but it also feels like a general you, or a universal, or you, whatever they call it, where it's sort of inviting you to speculate, to speculate on into the poem. But I want to look at another poem that's sort of like this, that where this poem, emerging from the context we were discussing, could be speaking about one specific type of event, but then it kind of stands independently on its own, even if you don't have that context. And like that, and as this poem does, I think another poem that does that is Notes from a Non-Existent Himalayan Expedition. So this was I know earlier I was saying I don't really remember where I was or when I first encountered her poems, but I remember that this was definitely one of the first poems of hers that I read. Notes from a Non-Existent Himalayan Expedition. So these are the Himalayas, mountains racing to the moon. The moment of their start, recording on the startling ripped canvas of the sky, holes punched in a desert of clouds, thrust into nothing, echo a mute white, quiet. Yeti, down there we've got Wednesday, bread, and alphabets. 2 times 2 is 4. Roses are red there, and violets are blue. Yeti, crime is not all we're up to down there. Yeti, not every sentence there means death. We've inherited hope, the gift of forgetting. You'll see how we give birth among the ruins. Yeti, we've got Shakespeare. Yeti, we play solitaire and violin. At nightfall, we turn lights on, Yeti. Up here, it's neither moon nor earth. Tears freeze. Oh, Yeti, semi-moon man, turn back, think again. I called this to the Yeti, inside 4 walls of avalanche, stomping my feet for warmth on the everlasting snow. All right. Before I start, before I come in and direct traffic in a very heavy-handed manner, does anyone else want to just jump in and say why this poem is awesome and what it can do for a room full of poets and readers like us?
So one of the beautiful things I think about this poem for a really wide audience as well as a writer is the way that the simplistic and the complex really bump up against each other. They're organized in almost like a conventional way, from stanza structure to the way the sentences are, but also in complexity. So we start with like 2 times 2 is 4. And then as the discussion about what the human race looks like, we've got Shakespeare and different types of, elevated the parts that we would think are more complex to explain to a Yeti. And so I think in that sense, there's like this really rich juxtaposition going on.
Yeah, there is a really rich juxtaposition. Sometimes, as Megan's pointing out, in the things that the speaker is explaining to the Yeti, sometimes it's the items themselves, but it's also this is kind of fantastic. So you have this mythical creature, the Yeti, and one of the things that I find sort of fascinating about this poem is it's a poem, you've got this mythical creature appears, and the speaker is sort of telling us a story about her encounter with that creature, and yet none of it is really about the Yeti. Like if I come up to you and I'm like, all right, last week I was in the mountains and I ran face first into a Yeti. I mean, you are going to have some questions about that, but instead, like, most of the poem is not about the Yeti. It's about like really ordinary stuff. It's about roses are red, violets are blue. Speaking of cliches from earlier, it's about violin and solitaire, and we turn the lights on at night, and giving birth, and 2 times 2 is 4, and we have Wednesday and alphabet and bread. Why is that? Why is it all about all this? Why is it like if I was going to say what's more interesting, a Yeti or Wednesday, the answer should almost always be a Yeti is more interesting. So but that is not the focus of this poem. What's going on with this juxtaposition of these 2 things, Yeti and the alphabet? Yeti on one side, Wednesday on the other. Randall,
Yeah, well, I'll ask a question first. Do others read the last stanza to indicate that she is imprisoned inside an avalanche that has happened? There are 4 walls. I don't see an exit, in which case she's saying something about what human culture has, but she is obstructed from it. So that would explain the sort of preoccupation with things that she ought to be a part of, but at the moment can't be. And the Yeti is the sort of Martian equivalent, to whom you can try to explain that situation in, this one is from the 60s, right? In very guarded language.
I don't know if I saw that as a prison, though. Now that you say that, I can't like quite unsee it. But it's also like I didn't see that as the speaker was currently, in prison, because that part was in the past. Like I called this to the Yeti inside four walls. So, but maybe they were in the moment. I hadn't thought about that prior to you saying that, though. Charlene, you have to unmute. Hey, Charlene, I think you're trying to talk, but you're muted.
You're so right. Thank you. The Yeti is a Yeti, and also mythological, but also a kind of hermit, a being who has wandered off to the top of the mountains and wants no part of civilization. And it seems to me she's trying to make a case for it. Most of the poem is the ordinary wonders of being closer to the earth and not tearing holes in the heavens. But I agree that last stanza suggests a kind of hermitage. I didn't see it so much as prison as being inside four walls, either the enclosure of the self or just where she prefers to stay.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to something you said. You said something like she's making a case for. All right, I'm gonna come back to that phrase a little bit later. Susan and then Leslie.
Oh yeah, it's just so interesting how the speaker is so lonely and wants to reach out to another being who has also survived in this environment that the speaker, the poet, finds herself in. So estrangement, and perhaps this is what war does. Who do you trust? Where do you turn to? What, how do you get out of your loneliness as a survivor? Or, how do you even talk to, people you might encounter, during and after? Because, everything has been turned upside down.
Yeah. You said something interesting there. The speaker is lonely, and I hadn't thought about that previously. So, but yeah, there's two people out here. There's the Yeti, and then there's this speaker, and I guess they're both out in the mountains, surrounded by the everlasting snow. Though the speaker seems to be a part of this civilization that she's describing to the Yeti. Leslie, hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
I wanted to comment on this poem, but about Szymborska's writing in general. I really admire the playfulness that she injects in her poems, and especially when grappling with these heavy topics that are difficult to write about. And the sense of sorrow that we're left with at the end of the poem, because this playfulness that she's urgently trying to reach toward doesn't ultimately get her to that place of hope. And that's how I read the last stanza. But there's in a lot of her poems, she has this reach towards using playfulness and reaching towards hope, and trying to carry it out on the page, but it not always panning out for her. And I think that's really interesting about her work.
Yeah, that is. It creates some unusual tensions when you're right. She can be talking about whether she's talking about her sister, and whether she's writing in praise of her sister and she's praising her sister because her sister doesn't write poems, or something like the aftermath of war. She can approach both of those subjects with the same sort of. There's often a sense of whimsy, whether the subject is inherently light or very grim. Simon, what were you going to say?
I wanted to say that we have to take note of the fact that in the title, this is described as a non-existent Himalayan expedition. I see this as a rumination on what I would say to a Yeti if I found myself confronting one on a Himalayan expedition. And what she would say to the Yeti is, don't go down there. Don't go down to civilization. And I see the last stanza as being one that is accepting where she is with the Yeti.
That word notes from a non-existent Himalayan expedition. The word non-existent, I guess this is where we'll go back to the poem we looked at before, Could Have, how the poem is about all the near misses we experience and things, on one hand, but then in another context, it's about surviving this war. And then notes from a non-existent Himalayan expedition, a lot of people say is doing something very similar. And a lot of times I've heard people point to that word non-existent, like that's Szymborska winking at you saying, I'm writing about this Himalayan expedition, but it's a non-existent Himalayan expedition. We know I'm not really writing about it. And so then people say, okay, then what is she writing about? And a lot of people have looked at this Yeti and said, and they see, someone said it sounds like the speaker's making a case, and what is the speaker making a case for? It sounds like wherever she's from, she's kind of defending it. She's saying crime is not all that we're up to down there. We've got all this other stuff. We got violins, we got Shakespeare, we've got and so why is she defending? So it becomes like a person defending essentially in some ways their way of life. And so if she's not doing that to a Yeti, a lot of people have speculate about, well, who is she defending down there too? And I've heard a couple different things. I've heard the Yeti is Stalin, and I've heard the Yeti is God. And Szymborska in an interview, when asked directly about this, said the Yeti is just a Yeti. So you can interpret that how you will, but there is this other reading there where it feels like it's someone defending their culture to a type of higher power or a type of like imposing force or something lofty and off on a mountain and far away and not connected to the remoteness of this village.
I just want to point out, Matthew, that you don't need the word non-existent in order for us to understand that she's not actually with a Yeti. I mean, it's really unnecessary. So I think that it's worth contemplating that a little further.
Allison, you've been raising your hand.
Hi, thank you, Matthew. I was just thinking that this poem has a similar arc to the last one, in that she sort of creates this hardline binary and then blurs it at the end or reverses it, makes a case, I guess, for the interchangeability. In this one, I feel like, and related to Simon's point about the word non-existent being necessary or unnecessary, I feel like there's a way in which there's potentially an argument to the self, like the imagination versus the practical world here. And what could seem like a kind of frothy myth and a kind of glittering snow world that's easily dismissed at the end is revealed not just as like an imaginative refuge, but a place of real force that has menace and danger. Because I don't know about you, but the four walls of that avalanche and stop the everlasting snow, it sounds sort of beautiful, but also kind of crushing. So I feel like there's this really interesting way of creating these sides, and then at the end, questioning the very notion of sides, which I think goes along with a lot of what you were talking about in terms of the history. So.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Henrietta? You've also got your digital hand raised.
I think a Yeti was just talking.
Sorry, I wasn't able to understand what was just said.
Type it in.
Rita, I think there might be a problem with your audio.
Okay. Try to type it in the chat if you're able to.
Hannah, could you mute her and tell her to type in?
Charlene? You're muted again.
I just wanted to make a couple quick comments. One, I love the way the title plays off the first line, non-existent Himalayan expedition. So these are the Himalayas. And also just some breathtakingly beautiful lines, mountains racing to the moon. It seems so oxymoronic because mountains aren't, the thought of mountains racing is so fresh and strange. And I just want to repeat that if the Yeti is just a Yeti, the Yeti is a hominid-like creature. He's like us, but wants no part of us. He's the ultimate hermit. He hides. So I see something in what she said there when she was asked.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that comes up, that question comes up, is when people talk about this type of censorship, Szymborska, the period of censorship she emerges from, and how that extends through, for a long time after that period of social realism. This is published right after that. This is published in 1950, like that ends in 1956. This poem is 1957. And so when people are saying, like, what types of poetry, how do these poets kind of find ways to write about what was going on without directly talking about it? I think the timing of when this poem was released in the world kind of contributes to that type of speculation. Elizabeth?
Hi, thanks. And forgive me not having my camera on. This poem makes me also think of, though it's pretty different, The Origin of Baseball by Kenneth Patchen, in which he talks about sort of this incoherent rage that human beings feel. And I feel like a lot of what she's doing, Szymborska is doing in the poem, is attacking the system that she's being oppressed by without making that clear. And it's almost as that they're on a new planet. Everything in their lives is new. They have a new censorship that's different than the Nazis. It's now the communists, and it's as if she's sending a time capsule back to people who are in a different time and space altogether. And so it's universal because it's rooted in the specific, but it is the universal human condition. She could be talking about climate change, not to liken anything to it. I mean, not to dismiss the horror of each individual historical event, but lately I've been thinking how history happens in rhymes, and they're not full rhymes. We don't recognize them even necessarily as rhymes. It's not just that history repeats itself, it's always slightly different. And I think both of these two poems speak to that, and speak completely to where we are as a species right now, in a world still pretty much dictated by white men.
All right, thank you. Hannah has nominated, I didn't notice, but Hannah has nominated Elizabeth to Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Oh, was this, were you the one who weren't able to raise your hand?
Yeah, it took me a while to figure
Okay,
that
I thought there
out.
might be another one in here. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
I just saw the chat now. So sorry
Yeah.
if I had missed you.
No problem.
And Susan's gonna come in and is gonna close us out on this poem, because I'm like looking
Oh
at
no.
time saying, oh my
Okay.
gosh, where has the time gone? We have so many
Oh.
other poems that I hoped to discuss.
Okay, well,
Mhm.
just that, as with the previous poem, what we come back to is life, the beating heart, and being able to stomp your feet because you are alive. And with the previous commentary, also to just, I don't know, extend that down to the basis of what is really important in all of this, history, life, whatever's, oppositions. That's what it is. And maybe she does that in all of her poems. I'm just don't know, but probably to bring back the fact that, being alive is what each individual perhaps is, that's where it's at. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And I see that in the chat, Henrietta had said it's an ironic statement from where she's writing, which is another kind of non-existence. And irony is another thing that feels very, very central to Szymborska's writing approach. And we've talked about a couple of them. Some of them have been mentioned already, such as contradiction, a sort of playfulness in the approach, and then irony, where there's where she's kind of winking at the reader, saying the reader understands one thing, even though the text is saying something else. So with those things in mind, let's look at let's say we should look at, Lot's wife. Does anyone else feel like reading this? I know you're hearing my voice a lot. Is there someone else who's thinking, I would love to read this poem?
Matthew, this is Jason. I'll read it.
Thank you, Jason.
Lot's wife. They say I looked back out of curiosity, but I could have had other reasons. I looked back, mourning my silver bowl, carelessly while trying my sandal strap, so I wouldn't have to keep staring at the righteous nape of my husband Lot's neck, from the sudden conviction that if I dropped dead, he wouldn't so much as hesitate, from the disobedience of the meek, checking for pursuers, struck by the silence, hoping God had changed his mind. Our two daughters were already vanishing over the hilltop. I felt age within me, distance, the futility of wandering, torpor. I looked back, setting my bundle down. I looked back, not knowing where to set my foot. Serpents appeared on my path, spiders, field mice, baby vultures. They were neither good nor evil now. Every living thing was simply creeping or hopping along in the mass panic. I looked back in desolation, in shame because we had stolen away, wanting to cry out, to go home, or only when a sudden gust of wind unbound my hair and lifted up my robe. It seemed to me that they were watching from the walls of Sodom and bursting into thunderous laughter again and again. I looked back in anger. I can't get the full rest of that line because of my screen. Thank you. I looked back in anger to savor their terrible fate. I looked back for all the reasons given above. I looked back involuntarily. It was only a rock that turned underfoot, growling at me. It was a sudden crack that stopped me in my tracks. A hamster on its hind paws tottered on the edge. It was then we both glanced back. No, I ran on, I crept, I flew upward until darkness fell from the heavens and with it the scorching gravel and dead birds. I couldn't breathe and spun around and around. Anyone who saw me must have thought I was dancing. It's not inconceivable that my eyes were open. It's possible I fell facing the city.
Thank you, Jason. So this poem does something that we've seen earlier, but it does it in a more pronounced manner. And could have, it was brought up how one idea comes up and then she contradicts it. You know, you were in luck, there was a forest. You were in luck, there were no trees. Or you were saved because you were the first. You were saved because you were the last. How an idea is brought up and then is sort of contradicted. And this poem does it just at the beginning. They say, I look back out of curiosity, but I could have had other reasons. And then the rest of the poem is those other reasons. So instead of having one statement and then an equal statement in the opposite direction, it's one statement and then like 100 statements in the opposite direction. And that's something I think is emblematic, is very emblematic of her work as well. There's a truth is asserted and then it is countered. And if you go through View with a Grain of Sand and just look at the opening few lines, you'll see, so here you have, they say I looked back out of curiosity, but, and then like that word but, you'll see something like that happen in the first couple lines of maybe 8 or 9 different poems. A few of the poems that I chose to include in this handout do have that same sort of move, like the Suicides Room. I'll bet you think the room was empty. Wrong. There's an assertion and then there's and then it's refuted. Or View with a Grain of Sand. We call it a grain of sand, but it calls itself neither grain nor sand. So that kind of movement in a Szymborska poem, that might be one of the single defining features in some ways, because it appears in a lot of poems. Sometimes in the first couple lines, sometimes it's much later. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes it doesn't have that word, but or wrong or something like that, but it's kind of implied. In fact, one of these translators, Stanislaw Baranczak, said that kind of idea is present in every one of Szymborska's poems, even if it doesn't have that immediate assertion and then rejection of the thing asserted. And I think there's a reason for that, but I was wondering how I was wondering how in this poem how you experience that movement. Like why even start with, they say I looked back out of curiosity? Why isn't it just like I could have looked back mourning my silver bowl? So asserting an idea and then immediately coming in saying, nah, that's not it. Like how does that work here? Hannah?
Oops, sorry, I'll let Chloe go.
Chloe? Hi, Chloe.
Hi, Matthew. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I love this poem, and I love the way this one almost like unpacks the previous two for me in a new way. There's something here which I think is about multiplicity and sort of like, what do you get in totalitarianism? You get this reductionism and you get a single narrative and you get a sort of anonymizing of individuality. And what these poems keep doing is even though they're not contextually specific, they're experientially specific. And this one keeps saying, you told this one story about me, right? There's this one story about Lot's wife, and I'm going to instead keep doubling back and multiplying that story. There's a kind of like resistance, I think, in this poem that I then see in the other poems too. There's a kind of like, even the moment of dancing at the end of the poem, anyone who saw me must have thought I was dancing. Well, she's not dancing, but she's also kind of like getting a dance in there. There's something sort of resistant and escapist and kind of like defiant and powerful in this poem that I think is so great, even though, of course, it's also full of darkness and horrors.
Yeah. Thank you, Chloe. Hannah, what were you going to say?
Well, this poem breaks open the previous one for me as well, because I realized in the discussion that I was reading the poem, I think, a little differently than other people, which is not that Szymborska is telling the Yeti to turn back away from the world, but to reconsider his decision to bury it. He's saying, think again. And in the middle of the avalanche, which has already happened, and this poem takes the stance of an irrevocable narrative or a death that has happened regardless, that there's no taking that back, much in the way that there's no way to bring back the generation of writers that was lost before her. And so that indeterminacy is a way of prospecting the space and continuing to fill it out. And it's less like the positivism of hope, which sometimes seems so cruel in the face of insurmountable suffering, but just the strange possibility of hoping God had changed his mind, or of rewriting the falling as a dance, that the back and forth can be a contradiction, but also a multiplier, that opposite and contradictory things can happen at once.
Can you say that last part? What can happen at once?
Opposite and contradictory experiences, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, opposite and contradictory experiences can happen at once, or many things happen at once. There's I think one of the things Szymborska's interested in is like even the simplest things have like this like rich complexity to it. And so she takes a story, and I look back at the title, like Lot's wife, that isn't given a name, and we like the one thing we know is like, oh, turned around out of curiosity, and then the way the poem, by presenting all those contradictory or multiple possibilities, she just gives us like this avalanche of possibility. She's kind of mines this one moment and gives all these other details. And it's possible that even the ones that they're not all totally canceling each other out or anything. Like there's like you're getting a sense of her self-righteous husband in one moment, and the things that she's losing in another, and while there might only be one reason, like many of these things that are being communicated might be true here. And it's giving us, and the poem is kind of giving us this portrait, a more depthful portrait of a person who's like a type of someone who's kind of cloaked in a type of anonymity, and it's asking us to kind of consider a life that's presented in generic terms, in a more depthful manner. Cami?
Well, Hannah kind of said it, think again. And along with everything you just said, I feel like it reminds me of this quote from To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. One of the characters says, "For nothing is simply one thing." And I just think that's very accurate for Szymborska. It's a sinking in, a further investigation, another approach. Don't stop. Keep looking, keep listening, keep opening. And it has to do with that point of view question too, I think, just a continuing to open out. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Elizabeth?
Thanks. Another thought that I have about this poem is I've heard that there's a great similarity between Polish sense of irony and what you described about asserting a truth and then contradicting it, and Jewish sensibility. And so there's a way where I feel like she's it's again goes back to the everyman comment that someone earlier made, that the eye here, it's almost as if it's a documentary film and there's a distance that's happening from the action that's being reported. The emotion is like off screen. It's not part of the storytelling, and that in tandem with sort of some of the shocking things that she says, the dissonance between those, the distance and also the sort of neutrality of the voice is extremely powerful when it comes to communicating from a place where you don't have the freedom of communication. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. There's this whole thing happening in the chat right now that I've just been missing this whole conversation. But Kava says that rhetorical hesitancy is what is so intoxicating to me about these poems. And I want to talk about that rhetorical hesitancy in a second. Let's look at another poem. Can we go to View with a Grain of Sand? So I'm now sort of improvising. This wasn't necessarily the one I was planning on talking about next, but it seems like a natural fit. After Lot's wife, where beginning, they say I looked back out of curiosity, but I could have had other reasons. And View with a Grain of Sand. We call it a grain of sand, but it calls itself neither grain nor sand. It does just fine without a name, whether general, particular, permanent, passing, incorrect, or apt. Our glance, our touch mean nothing to it. It doesn't feel itself seen and touched, and that it fell on the windowsill is only our experience, not its. For it is no different from falling on anything else, with no assurance that it has finished falling or that it is falling still. The window has a wonderful view of a lake, but the view doesn't view itself. It exists in this world colorless, shapeless, soundless, odorless, and painless. The lake's floor exists floorlessly, and its shore exists shorelessly. Its water feels itself neither wet nor dry, and its waves to themselves are neither singular nor plural. They splash deaf to their own noise on pebbles neither large nor small. And all this beneath a sky by nature skyless, in which the sun sets without setting at all, and hides without hiding behind an unminding cloud. The wind ruffles it, its only reason being that it blows. A second passes, a second, a third, but they're 3 seconds only for us. Time has passed like a courier with urgent news, but that's just our simile. The character is invented, his haste is make-believe, his news inhuman. So this poem has that same sort of gesture. I mean, it's a very different poem after, but it opens with this assertion. We call it a grain of sand, but it calls itself neither grain nor sand. I'm not sure if Kava is still here, but Kava, when you're talking about rhetorical hesitancy, if you are here and I like butcher this, like feel free to step in and say that's not what I meant at all. But that's a thing I've noticed too. I didn't have a term rhetorical hesitancy, but there's I think she's making an argument, and it might be a sort of veiled hesitant or a feigned hesitancy. It might be a pretend hesitancy where it's sort of astonishing in a world where people are very unlikely to change their mind about anything. So many of these poems just begin from this position of something you believe, you as the reader, and something you believe is wrong, and often I become convinced kind of quickly. We call it a grain of sand. I'm like, yeah, I call it, like if you showed me a grain of sand, I would say that's a grain of sand and be very certain about in my belief of that. And then she says, but it calls itself neither grain nor sand. And then I would say, all right, you got me on that one. Point Szymborska. So I feel there's but she's not really confrontational in telling you that you're wrong usually. And that comes back to something someone else was saying earlier about how there's a sense of playfulness too. So this rhetorical hesitancy, like kind of there's a sense of maybe feigned naivete where it's kind of disarming, because she's not saying, all right, you're wrong. She's saying, I just kind of noticed this thing. Although I think on some level she's very certain about the direction she's going, and she's asking kind of like good-natured, innocent, rhetorical questions. But what about this? Like there's a type of that playfulness creates a sense of almost non-confrontation, even though she's often saying, "Here's what you believe. Here's how it's wrong," and that's kind of that's kind of fascinating to me. Susan, what you're next in the queue.
Oh, okay. I think that was from before, but
okay.
I noticed too how maybe this is wrong from from the point of view of what the conversation has been this afternoon, but I wonder too, is she sort of reporting, or is she able to speak from the dead place, or is she sort of telling what it's like? Because she and other, she and, I don't want to say everyone else, but to survive a war, she actually died too, but yet she's alive. I don't know, maybe I was just thinking something like that.
Thank you. And so, sorry if I missed you on the last round and put you on the spot there. Allison.
Well, I feel like this is such a perfect poem to follow the last one, because when you were talking with the last one about how Lot's wife is asking to be viewed in a more depthful way, as you said, I feel like the opposite's also true. There's this bucking of causation, as someone mentioned before, and this bucking of myth making, like you're trying to put on what potentially was an accidental fall, this huge myth with huge significance. And I think the same thing is happening here. And maybe that's one of the reasons it doesn't feel like a lecture, because the corrective vote, like, okay, we call it a grain of sand, but it calls itself neither grain nor sand. The vote for the corrective alternative is like so modest. It's like, don't plump it up, don't amp it up so much, and so it feels like there's this case to make for like against the folly and the danger of putting huge myths on casual things, which I just think is so remarkable, because it comes out with force, but it's like sort of just making a kind of let be finale of seem argument. Anyhow, I just think these poems together are just so interesting.
Me too. I also think they're interesting. Thank you, Allison. Stevie. You're still muted, Stevie.
In this particular collection, whatever she gives, she takes away. She says, we do not, basically she's saying, the world does not need us. We have all these things I can name, but the character is invented, his haste is make-believe, his news, inhuman. We have sand, but it isn't sand. We mustn't misread our role in things, because she's really saying we're not affecting the world or nature. We may experience it, but then she takes it away, each thing. The window has a wonderful view of a lake, but the view doesn't view itself. It just exists. I found everything in this particular, is this a view from the bridge? I've forgotten the name of the collection. They were all of.
What collection is View with a Grain of Sand in?
It's something to do with the bridge. I've forgotten.
People on a Bridge?
Yes. And it was incredible consistency of viewpoint throughout it. Giving but taking away, and do not misread your own actions or words or view, because it is not going to change what is actually there, which is nothing to do with us. And
Thank you, Stevie. All right,
quite
we're gonna
different from the early poems we were just discussing. The one when she's in her 30s, the poem we just read, that's closer to the war, as someone else said. This is a little more distant, and she's, what, this must be in 86 or something. She's already in her 50s or 60s, so has a different view of it all.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I do want to move on to at least one more poem, but I'm going to go. So let's hear from like one more person on this poem, and then we'll move to another one. Kathy, we haven't heard from you yet, and you have had your hand raised. So
okay,
we'll give you the last word on.
Yeah, I appreciated what Stevie said, and to me, all of these poems are in some way not really a railing against God per se, but the idea that everything happens for a reason. You know, in the first poem we looked at, it's like a counterbalance to that. This is like how everything is not about human ability to make or unmake things. That's really all. I was just saying, thinking about how they all have a certain commonality in that way.
Yeah. I like that word, commonality, and there's I think there's like this multiplicity of meaning there and how we might apply it. You know, commonality in some ways, like Szymborska operates from a phrase that nothing is common, and part of her subject matter is often to take something sort of ordinary and kind of elevate it in a way. And I think when going back to the poem about the Yeti, like if we think about anytime you put the spectacular or the fabulous next to the ordinary or the mundane, there's usually one of two effects. You're either taking down the spectacular or the fabulous, or you're elevating the ordinary or the mundane, or a little bit of both. But then the other idea of commonality is like the sort of like holding things in common, which I think is what you're thinking of, and like these sort of links between all these different things, which feels very applicable there. Let's move on to or one last thing on this poem, The View of the Grain of Sand. So that was the title of this book. Although this book, I think that title, I assume that title was her translators, though maybe Szymborska contributed that title to this selected. I'm not positive, but I think it's I think entitling the collection that directs our attention to this poem in a more highlighted manner. And I think one reason for that choice is like this poem is doing something that feels sort of embodies a lot of the poems in the collection. The way it's constantly looking at something, saying you think this but it's not that, or you think this but our perception is wrong, or that's just our perception. And there's we might think of one of her modes as a mode of defamiliarization, of looking at something and then trying to look at it from an unfamiliar angle. Victor Shklovsky, in talking about defamiliarization, he was saying that part of the idea behind defamiliarization was that familiarity makes things routine, and then we overlook things because we're familiar with them. So something that's wonderful or something that's terrible, we might just take it for granted and say, oh, it's just the way it is, and just view it as normal. In his essay, Art as Device, Shklovsky was saying that the job of the artist is to make people not do that. And so Szymborska is kind of doing that very repeatedly, saying, here's a grain of sand, but is it a grain of sand? Or here's a window, but is it a window? And then like looking at it from a slightly different direction. And the next poem I want to look at is it'll probably be the last poem we look at. So what is happening with time? Yeah, let's look at True Love. True love. Is it normal? Is it serious? Is it practical? What does the world get from two people who exist in a world of their own, placed on the same pedestal for no good reason, drawn randomly from millions, but convinced it had to happen this way? In reward for what? For nothing. The light descends from nowhere. Why on these two and not on others? Doesn't this outrage justice? Yes, it does. Doesn't it disrupt our painstakingly erected principles and cast the moral from the peak? Yes, on both accounts. Look at the happy couple. Couldn't they at least try to hide it, fake a little depression for their friend's sake? Listen to them laughing. It's an insult. The language they use, deceptively clear, and their little celebrations, rituals, the elaborate mutual routines, it's obviously a plot behind the human race's back. It's hard to guess. It's hard to even guess how far these things might go if people start to follow their example. What could religion and poetry count on? What would be remembered? What renounced? Who'd want to stay within bounds? True love, is it really necessary? Tact and common sense tell us to pass over it in silence, like a scandal in life's highest circles. Perfectly good children are born without its help. It couldn't populate a planet in a million years. It comes along so rarely. Let the people who never find true love keep saying there's no such thing. Their faith will make it easier for them to live and die. So this poem, it feels like it has a lot of the things that have come up today. There's the idea of how she's sort of contradicting an idea. She asserts ideas and then contradicts it or refutes it. That sense of playfulness, even as she's saying, yeah, something you believe in is wrong. The sense of irony, because I think she says one thing, she's making an argument here, like true love, it's not really practical. Do we really need it? No, we don't. Although I don't think the reader is likely to sort of buy it. I don't think that the reader is going to thinks that's what she's actually trying to get at here. So the idea of irony, a lot of these ideas are sort of feel like they're in play in this one. Like, but before I go on a longer extended monologue, was there anything about this poem that leapt out to you all, or something that any of you were drawn to in this one, or that you found interesting?
Well,
Kathy again.
yeah, I know this is not awkward, but curious, because when I was listening to this, I was thinking how rhetorically similar it is to your own work. And I wondered if you had seen that, or, what you saw in it that played out in your work.
In this poem, or Szymborska in general?
No, this poem in particular.
I hadn't thought about this poem in particular, though I would say Szymborska is like one of my go-to poets, and is a poet that I've learned a lot from, thinking about how like sort of her sense of delight, a sense of whimsy, her sense of skepticism and comic skepticism and irony, how they can sort of undercut sometimes more potentially grim subjects. But even the sort of poem where she's addressing a yeti. I mean, I have tons of poems that I'm always writing the things that are never going to speak back to me, or the things that don't exist. But I don't want to turn this into a whole conversation on my poems. So Szymborska, True Love. Thank you for that question, though. Kathleen.
Myself. It seems that the speaker is taking on the role of the autocratic government, speaking about love. That's how I approach it. It's very political, all the way through. It just seems that she's doing that on purpose. Is that
She's
how
doing
you
that on
read it?
purpose?
Right. I mean, the voice is the government speaking about love, afraid that people will follow this one couple, be like this one couple. That's how I read it.
Yeah, I think I don't think the speaker is supposed to be the voice of the government, but it could come across that way because I think it imitates things that might be not necessarily of love. The way I see it happening is it's like the second sentence. Is it normal? Is it serious? Is it practical? That's the part that makes this poem feel political to me, because like that would be something that I think, if you're coming out of a time where art couldn't say some things and was supposed to be serious and was supposed to uphold a certain agenda, art that doesn't do that, would have faced these questions. Is it normal? Is it serious? Is it practical? And I mean, a lot of things were kind of evaluated by that standard. So yeah, I do think this is a political poem in another direction. And I do think, like, where you're sort of hearing, oh, is this the voice of the government? I think she puts true love in there and sort of kind of replaces the actual subject matter with true love, though.
It's ironic. Look at the happy couple, couldn't they at least try to hide it, just, it's very,
I think in this poem, the point, part of the argument, so part of the argument is I think she's assuming that the irony is that we should disagree with her. Like, I don't think she expects people to say, like, two people are in love. Doesn't this outrage justice? Yes, it does. Like, she goes like so far to the extreme. She's like, look at these people in love. It's obviously a plot against the human, behind the human race's back or something. So there's this thing where she's kind of saying there's a thing that, here's this thing that we all know that it's not practical, it's not normal, it's not serious, and we can, because it's not normal, because it's not practical, because it's not serious, is it a plot against the government? Is it a plot against humanity? No, of course not. There's something else going on here. Is kind of like what she's asking, and so I think she's asking. So if you like, we can read this as a poem about love, and if we were thinking back to how our poems might have sometimes like this hidden or invisible subject, which this poem kind of exists completely without that political context. But sorry, I think I just lost where I was going with this one, but so because I've lost my train of thought there, and I've got 4 other hands raised, I'm just going to turn to Susan. What were you going to say here?
I was thinking of that this seems very much like a song, and maybe that's how the translation comes across. But that album, Jacques Brel is alive and well and living in Paris. My mom had that album and we always listened to it. This sort of whirlwind kind of song that is, I don't know, just sort of goes round and round. That's the image I have when I read this, that it comes from song, or it's like a song.
The poem feels like a song?
Yes.
Because was there a particular song, or were you saying that the language of it was song-like?
The language, it reminds me of that album, Jacques Brel. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Jacques Brel I think it's called Alive and Well and Living in Paris. And then there were songs on this record album that we listened to when I was growing up. And the songs are very sort of exuberant, and but they're not really the words don't match. I don't know what it's called. The words don't match the meaning or something like that.
Yeah. I could see that. I could see how that comes up in Szymborska's poems sometimes, where the tone, like the speaker's attitude toward the subject matter, might not seem to match the content, where the tone might be more playful than the content would seemingly dictate. Elizabeth, and then Stevie and Martha also, but we'll go to Elizabeth. Then I'm just going in the order that you all are queued up here.
Thanks. So one thing I keep thinking about all of these poems is her relationship to dissonance and how to communicate or best evoke that, but also, and more in the last poem than this one, but the final line of this poem, it seems to me, I keep thinking Auschwitz, and how one of the things that happened was people had no idea that they were part of this mass network of concentration camps, because we lose sight of the scope. And I feel like her poems all speak to that, and to the reaction to Auschwitz, and Auschwitz being in Poland, and Poland's relationship to both Germany and the Soviet Russia, but even here in this poem.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Stevie?
Wow. I really see this and feel this as, I see the rhythm of the Jacques Brel kind of thing, but it's sort of she's using irony as a defense against any kind of cliched thinking. So she'll knock anything aside that is in the realm of the cliched view. Erected principles, what does she have later? Religion and poetry, the things we hide behind. And she wants to knock that back. And so her tone, I think, becomes more ironical here than in some of the others. And especially if he's using, with the title, love as the subject. And then their faith will make it easier for them to live and die. Well, she's buried them with that line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Stevie. Martha, you've been patiently.
Well, it's kind of a devastating ending, right? And the person who knows love of anything is gonna find it very difficult to live. And the person who doesn't can get through life. The person who is guarded. We've got in the one poem, the speaker who's inside this guarded, cold place of the avalanche, trying to stomp up and down to keep warm, to remain alive. And here talking about those who have to go through, for whatever reasons, whether it's to survive for political reasons or whatever, go through in this kind of guarded way. So it feels like it's basically saying, at the end, the poem is moving toward that place again of heightened emotion, which is not being directly evoked. This is indirect expression of emotion, an example of that at the end, which is, if you're gonna feel it, it's gonna be hard to get through your life. That's just the way it is. It's very painful. And so that for me feels like a similar heightened place that this poem is, that the other poems are leading to these heightened places at the end. They're like ramps to these heightened emotional places. And this is no exception, but it's tamped down language-wise at the end.
Yeah, there's a sort of like those last few lines, there's a sort of bluntness and clarity. I mean, it's every bit as sort of plain spoken as any other part of her poems, but she sort of removes the playfulness that she has a lot of times. Like there's a sort of severity in those last few lines by way of contrast. Any other thoughts on this poem? Margot, you raised your actual hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I just want to thank you so much for starting off with the history and with the reminder of the presence of censorship, because I feel like that is the secret to these poems, that she's writing in a code which we understand, but we can't say out loud what it is, as she couldn't say out loud many of the things that this group has expressed so clearly, what's really inside the heart of the poem. I think it's almost like a language for the censor, but the censor will be so stupid that he will not understand it. It was really good workshop. Thank you, Matthew. I'm really happy to have been here.
Thank you. Yeah, I started with thinking about the history because I do think sometimes that it adds a layer to her poems to know that. Though one of the things I admire the most is that you actually don't need to know any of that for these to be really wonderful poems. Like the first many times I read her work, her poems, I was just encountering the poems as they were, and if I didn't know any history about Polish literature in general, Polish actual history, Szymborska's history, or personal history or life, that's the poems work on their own. Each one stands on their own in its own context without that surrounding context. But yeah, if you're thinking about censorship and the ways she sort of developed the sort of indirect way of speaking about some very complicated topics, I think that might it adds a layer to when we realize, oh, this could be about another thing. Like when I was talking about defamiliarization earlier, in this poem, when I read it initially, I would have thought, oh, true love is the thing it's defamiliarized, it's put in another context. But then I later started realizing, no, it's that second line. Is it normal? Is it serious? Is it practical? She's kind of, it's a critique of a society. It says things need to be practical for it to be valuable. She takes a thing that people believe. It's a kind of a risky poem because she's taking a sort of societal belief and then she puts it in a completely unfamiliar context. People would never say these things about love. No one says, oh, love, it's pointless, therefore love, it's not practical, or love, it's not normal. So she takes that way of this way of thinking and puts it in a new context to kind of defamiliarize it, the subject, and make you look at it in a different way. And that's sort of this sort of kind of skepticism she has toward received beliefs feels like it's very central to her work. Like when I was saying, a lot of her poems begin with an assertion and then immediately refute it, and often it seems like it's not something, like the arguments she's making, they're not necessarily controversial arguments. Sometimes, like if she says, oh, you think this is a grain of sand and you're wrong, like that's not something that I have like this deep-seated belief in, that I feel like I need to like go like fight someone over. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll listen to you. But that happening over and over and over throughout poems, it's kind of fascinating, because it's one of the reasons that I like thinking about this book as a whole, because the poems that themselves, they work on their own. They're their own fine, perfect poems without any additional context. But when you read them sort of as in their entirety, you realize like each one is kind of saying, here's something you believe, Here's how it might be wrong. Here's something else you believe. Here's how it might be wrong. Here's like one after another. And you realize that the subject of her work over time is, I think it was Ed Hirsch who said that the body of Szymborska's work is essentially functioning as a defense of individual subjectivity against collective thinking or collective thought. Like that's the subject of her poems as a whole, and where she feels like there's a real danger in sort of just like accepting the first thought because that's the collective thought. So we have like 2 minutes left, and I want to thank everyone for being here and for Martha for inviting me to do this, and Hannah for making things function, and everyone for chiming in with their thoughts and their thoughts and ideas on these poems. I think with these last 2 minutes, I think I will give the last word to Szymborska. I thought I would end it with like a few words from her Nobel lecture. Like this is near the end of her Nobel lecture, but it feels like it kind of gets at something that these poems are getting at also. The world, whatever we might think when terrified by its vastness and our own impotence, or embittered by its indifference to individual suffering of people, animals, and perhaps even plants. For why are we so sure plants feel no pain? Whatever we might think of its expanses pierced by the rays of stars surrounded by the planets we've just begun to discover. Planets already dead, still dead, we just don't know. Whatever we might think of this measureless theater to which we've got reserved tickets, but tickets whose lifespan is laughably short, bounded as it is by 2 arbitrary dates. Whatever else we might think of this world, it is astonishing. But astonishing is an epithet concealing a logical trap. We're astonished, after all, by things that deviate from some well-known and universally acknowledged norm, from an obviousness we've grown accustomed to. Now, the point is, there is no such obvious world. Our astonishment exists per se and isn't based on comparison with something else. Granted, in daily speech, where we don't stop to consider every word, we all use phrases like the ordinary world, ordinary life, the ordinary course of events. But in the language of poetry, where every word is weighed, nothing is usual or normal, not a single stone and not a single cloud above it, not a single day and not a single night after it, and above all, not a single existence, not anyone's existence in this world. So I'll end there. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.